Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Brankley and welcome to this video on evaluating patterns of escalation in sexual offending using a case study. This video has been rated novice, which means I've done my best to make the content accessible to everyone. This video is based on a published journal article that I wrote with my two colleagues, Alistair Goodwill and Kylie Reale. You can find the link to the full article below in the description. If you have any questions or comments about the content or use of this video, please comment below or email me directly. Before I begin, I want to take time to remember the two women killed by Mr. Williams, Corporal Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd. Seeing their faces motivates me to be the best I possibly can at my job so that together we can keep our communities safe. Okay, so what does the title of the video mean? What is escalation in sexual offending?
What about escalation?
Escalation.
Well, Batman, when someone commits a crime, a question is not only how likely is it that they will commit a new crime, they also sometimes want to know if their offending can become worse. And in fact, there are two ways in which it could become worse. The following is taken from a paper by Liu, Francis, and Soothill published in 2011. The link to the article is below in the description. So there are two approaches to escalation. The first one looks at the time between offenses, or cool down period. This means we are looking for changes in how long it takes for the individual to offend again. But a question might be, which offenses do you include? Do you focus only on the sexual offenses? What about the violent offenses? Non-contact sexual offenses? What about offenses that are neither of those but are somehow functionally related to them? For example, fetish burglaries. If the purpose or goal of the offenses, contact or not, are similar based upon your case conceptualization, it might be relevant to include. The second type of escalation has to do with escalation in the seriousness of the crime. But what does serious mean? Are you just speaking to violence? For example, using weapons, bindings, maybe unfortunately the presence of mutilation, maybe the approach they used with the victim? Or you could be looking at atypical sexual behaviors or paraphilic behavior. Some researchers have found that these behaviors are enacted through a cyclical reinforcing process. This means they are likely to continue and get worse over time. Another important factor to consider is life events. Contextual and situational life events are often been found to underpin sexual offending. In particular, acute stressful events typically precede the perpetration of a sexual offense. Now, these findings are all well and good, but research is often the process of looking at trends across groups, where one group acts a bit differently than another group. We call this approach nomothetic. Now, for some people, doubt lingers about how well research can apply to an individual. An approach is idiographic when it's concerned with the application to specific individuals. Now, in this video, we are going to examine how well our nomothetic knowledge can be applied to predict outcomes in a particular case. This case is that of former Colonel Russell Williams. Mr. Williams was a former colonel in the Canadian Air Force and was in charge of Canada's largest base, CFB Trenton, pictured here and existing somewhere between Toronto and Ottawa in Ontario. In 2006, Mr. Williams began a series of sexually motivated offenses, including 82 instances of fetish-motivated burglary, 4 sexual assaults, 2 of which ended in murder. Now, if you are interested in more details about the case, I have made a list of resources below in the description. The investigation and conviction of Mr. Williams provides a useful investigative case study, as a large amount of forensic evidence, such as the photographs he took at the crime scenes, undergarments that he stole and itemized, all of this data was collected from both crime scenes and Mr. Williams' homes, providing much insight into his offending behavior. The investigation and conviction of Mr. Williams provides a useful case study, as a large amount of forensic evidence, such as photographs he took during the offenses, undergarments he collected, was available at both the crime scenes and Mr. Williams' homes. This provides us with a lot of insight into his offending behavior in terms of timing and activity. And also, we can take this data and quantitatively analyze it in terms of escalation in the frequency and seriousness of his offending behavior. So let's begin with measuring changes in the frequency of offending. I'm going to show you a graph. The bottom axis is a timeline, a count of days from the first offense in the series to the very last offense 4 years later. The vertical axis is the cool down period, representing the number of days till the next offense. The offenses, shown here as little circles, represent the fetish burglaries. These were cases where he was breaking into homes with the express purpose of finding underwear or other assorted objects to masturbate to. Now, the closer these circles are to the bottom line, the quicker the next offense happened. So, using this as a backdrop, let me tell you the general narrative of the offense cycle and how we use life events to demarcate stages of his offending. The first phase, labeled exploratory, represents the beginning of Mr. Williams' offending history at the age of 44. This stage extended from his very first offense on September 9th, 2007, to a close call incident he had on November 1st, 2007. So during this November 1st offense, the residents, who were actually next door at a barbecue, returned home briefly to find an assailant, Mr. Williams, inside their home. Mr. Williams fled the house immediately, and although he actually was acquainted with the family residing there, they were not able to identify him as the intruder. Following that incident, he didn't offend again for 135 days. The second phase we labeled intensification. It includes offenses occurring between March 15th, 2008 and November 8th, 2008. This phase begins with Mr. Williams' return to offending after almost being caught during that exploratory phase offense. And it continues until he becomes aware that he may be imminently promoted to the rank of colonel. Compared to the exploratory phase, you might notice a denser collection of offenses near the bottom of the axis. This means he was offending more quickly. The maintenance phase begins November 12th, 2008, when Mr. Williams is posted to the Canadian Forces Language School at the Astico Centre in Gatineau to learn French, an essential step in attaining the promotion to colonel. And it ends around 632 days into his offending. Now, this phase sees Mr. Williams stabilize in offending frequency with relatively longer cool-down periods between offenses. It seems at this increasingly busy phase of his work life, Mr. Williams offended only about once per month. The final phase, deterioration, began on June 2nd, 2009 and completed on January 29th, 2010. Now, this phase begins just prior to the first contact offense. The two blue arrows demarcate the two contact sexual offenses, and the two red arrows demarcate the two sexual murders. So the deterioration phase is suggestive of broad and significant escalation in frequency and deviancy in his offending. In the beginning of this phase, Mr. Williams transferred to be commander of CFB Trenton, but we also see a number of incidents of unusual and uncharacteristic behavior beginning in September 2009. Mr. Williams missed several compulsory events formerly intended by the base commander, as well as reportedly blanking out for several minutes during a speech given at the Canadian Air Force's school in Portage-la-Prairie in Winnipeg. According to attendees, Mr. Williams stood blankly, staring into the crowd for several minutes before simply continuing as if nothing had occurred. During this period, it was also brought into evidence that Mr. Williams wrote, but did not actually send, a letter to the fetish burglary victim from whom he stole an astonishing 186 items of clothing. This letter was found in a Word document on his computer entitled by the name of the child. I will not read it presently, but I will make it available to you below in the description section. So now that you have a sense of the narrative, let's see if there are any patterns of escalation in the frequency of offenses. First, I started with a simple linear regression model, where I was looking to see if the cool-off period decreased over time. Yes, there was a significant relationship, and the regression line here accounted for 5.7% of the variance, which may not sound like a lot, but it's actually not bad. That being said, maybe we can do better. It seems to me that the maintenance phase has a longer cool down period on average than the intensification or deterioration phase. So what do you think? Does he slow down? In fact, he does. This cubic regression model shows that if you use a non-linear relationship between the two variables, you can account for 15.1% of the variance, a significant improvement over the plain linear regression model. Let me explain what this cubic regression is telling us. In the first phase, you see a relatively flat relationship that seems only to speed up because in the intensification phase, he starts offending every couple days. Now the maintenance phase, again, it seems more stable, like the exploratory phase, with longer cooldown periods. This changes in the deterioration phase when Mr. Williams starts offending much more quickly. Another way to check if the life events approach worked is by comparing the mean cooldown period from the four phases. They were significantly different from each other. So, just to summarize, if you're thinking of escalation in terms of frequency of offending, then it is likely that escalation will not be linear, but responsive to what is going on in the individual's life and environment. Okay, so let's look into the seriousness of offenses. Rather, does Mr. Williams become more violent or sexually deviant as he progresses through his offenses? In some ways, the answer is obvious, because yes, he ends up committing sexual murder. But was there changes in the seriousness noticeable even during the fetish burglaries? Let's find out. So we actually know a lot about the offenses, including how long he spent there based upon the timestamps of the pictures he took. Whether he put on clothes, whether he masturbated, also the number of clothes or other objects he took from the house. So we take all of this information and more and enter it into a latent cluster analysis. Now the cluster analysis is an advanced statistical technique that's actually very similar to like reading tea leaves. What we're really looking for is clumps or patterns that can help us make sense of all this information. For a glossary of all the tea leaves, variables we used, look at Appendix A in the paper. Regardless, we found 4 groups or types of offenses. An unsuccessful group, which represented 13.3% of all the offenses, includes all the offenses in which Mr. Williams was unsuccessful in gaining access to the home. The low deviance cluster, representing about 31.3% of offenses, identified burglaries in which Mr. Williams was not naked nor did he masturbate during any of the offenses. The medium deviance of cluster, roughly 27.7% of offenses, were characterized by Mr. Williams being naked and masturbating only once during the crime, but nearly a third of the time after the offense. The high deviance cluster, roughly 27.7% of all offenses, were the most serious of all fetish burglaries. Mr. Williams was naked inside the victim's home for almost every offense. More often than not, he masturbated, and the average time spent in the house was almost an hour, and it was longer than all other offenses. So let's see if there are any differences in seriousness across the 4 offense phases. The exploratory phase had no unsuccessful offenses and was made up mostly of moderate and high deviance offenses. Although moderate and high deviance offenses stay common in the intensification phase, Mr. Williams had many more unsuccessful and low deviance offenses than he did before. In the maintenance phase, most of the offenses were unsuccessful or low deviance. The final phase, deterioration, had the highest number of deviant offenses. Just like frequency of offending, measuring the progression of seriousness was non-linear, with the maintenance phase having the least serious type of offenses. Now, it may be the case that positive life events, example, training for his promotion, are related to decreases in the frequency and severity of offending. So what are the applied or take-home messages from this research? First, exploring patterns in escalation may help case conceptualization by examining factors that may be associated with changes in his offending, for example, life events. A second take-home message is the importance of looking at the client's offense and behavioral history for instances of behaviors or offenses that are functionally related to his more serious offenses. So, for example, how in the case of Mr. Williams, the sexual interests he displayed in his fetish burglaries were also present in his contact sex offenses. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I would like to thank Ryerson University and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Without their support, this research would not have been possible. Please feel free to share this video for training or teaching purposes. I'm also happy for you to use the video or slides in your own presentation. I ask you to reference it accordingly, which you can do so by just leaving the copyright at the bottom of the screen and putting the reference in your reference section. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or comments. And if you liked this video, then I hope you check out my other videos and subscribe to my YouTube channel.